Welcome to the unSeminary podcast. Are you looking for practical ministry help to drive your ministry further, faster? Have a sinking feeling that your ministry training didn't prepare you for the real world? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others in pursuit of stuff that we wish they had taught in seminary. Buckle up and let's get started with this week's unSeminary podcast.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the unSeminary podcast. My name's Rich, the host around these parts. Happy Thursday. We are so honored that you would take some time out to put us in your earbuds, as we say, to listen in on today's conversation. Now, I got to be honest, I was a little nervous about today's conversation. So the two gentlemen who have served the church have done just incredible work that I'm honored and privileged to have on the show today. We're over 200 episodes, and I think this is probably going to go down as one of my favorite ones. So we've got Warren Bird and Carl George on the line today. Warren Bird's been on a few times. I think this is your third time. Are you a three-peat, Warren? Which is, I think you're maybe one of two people that's been on three times. Warren is works for Leadership Network, has the best title in the world, and I just love him dearly. He's one of those guys that when he called me up and said, hey, I'd love to chat, the answer is always yes. And then Carl George, who you may know is author, was a professor for years at Fuller, is a wonderful guy. So why don't we start? We're going to start with just you guys introducing yourselves a little bit. Warren, why don't we start with you?
I love Jesus, and I love seeing his church grow. And years ago, I got connected up with Carl George, and he was teaching the how to break the 200 barrier, how to break the 400 barrier, how to break the 800 barrier. And he was exhausted, and the groups were full. And I said, Carl, why can't we turn this into a book so that you could go home once in a while and that people could benefit from it? And so we took the best of all those workshops and turned it into a book that has just done so well over the years that the publisher came and said, hey, it's still percolating, update it, re-release it, and here we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Carl, why don't you give us a sense of your story?
Well, I put out my first book with Bob Logan, but our publisher said we really needed help, and they found Warren for us. And that has turned into a lifelong collaboration.
Nice.
I am thrilled to work with Warren. He has the kind of a mind that is awesome. He'll listen to recordings from 4 or 5 different seminars and remember them distinctly so well that he can say in the second recording, that's the best way to say that. In the fourth recording, that's the best way to say that. And he pulls that stuff together in such an amazing way so that when it comes back to me, all I have to do is tweak a few pronouns and look for gaps. But he's been a wonderful collaborator, and he's got, I guess, 26 books under his belt now. Is that the number? But
well, it's 29, but who's counting? But Carl, he asked about you, and you have an incredible background.
Yes.
Well, we started out as church planters. My wife and I did after youth work in one of the earliest mega churches, and in Miami, Florida, and then the Lord called us very clearly to Gainesville, Florida, to start a church there. And we were there for 13 years until we got the call to Fuller. In the process of that time, we experienced those barriers, the 2 and 4 and 8, and it was quite a challenge. But we worked out the pieces of it. And then when I met Peter Wagner and the crew out at Fuller, all the pieces came together, and the language necessary to explain it to others came together. And 6 or 7 years in, we were ready to do our first book, and Warren showed up on the scene about that time. So we've had a marvelous time, 100 denominations all over North America and internationally as well. And we've been greatly blessed by the pastors have given us their questions. That's the greatest gift a consultant can ever have, is the questions that come from people who are in the middle of the fight. And then we go out and research it and figure out what it is that they need and are missing, and go from there. You have this unSeminary idea, which I'm rather pleased with, and the only contention I have with that idea is that when we ask, as seminarians, we ask our people who are coming to our conferences, would you like to have studied this in seminary? They first of all say, oh, absolutely. They should have taught us this in seminary. And then they stop and they think about it a little bit and they say, but in seminary, no, I wasn't ready.
I'm thinking about
Until I'd been out beaten up a little bit. I didn't. Now, yes, this is what I would like to have been taught in seminary, but there's no chance that if I had been taught it or exposed to it, it would have saved me. I still needed the hard knocks and the experience is necessary to make me ready for learning. So in a sense, I love your unseminary idea, but when you catch people out of seminary, you are getting them at a learnable or teachable moment.
No, I appreciate that. Appreciate that. That's a huge compliment. I just this weekend was I'm helping on overseers of a church plant, and so I was down there trying to, it was one of these encouragement trips. I was there to try to, it's going to be okay, one of those kind of trips. And I was reflecting on your work, with this book from, years ago. And this church basically have settled out just above 200. And again, I found myself using the 200, 400, 800 barrier language, which I was smiling inside knowing that this conversation was coming up this week. It's been, that seminal understanding, and I'm excited for this new, this new book. Well, why don't we, Warren, why don't we jump in? Some churches grow rapidly up to a point, and they kind of, they hit a barrier. The whole point of this book is how to break barriers. Why is that? Why are there these kind of barriers kind of built into the church growth process?
Well, Rich, yes, there are barriers. And the second half of the book does talk about, the 200, 400, and they all have different issues associated. But the biggest barrier, which the whole first half of the book deals with, what is between the church leaders' two ears? What voices are they hearing? What vision do they have? What caps do they have on their vision? What biases, how strong is their bias towards growth? How much do they perceive their role? And that's the subtitle of the book now: Revise Your Role, Release Your People, and Capture Overlooked Opportunities for your church. The what's in their mind: are they the minister or the minister maker? Are they the caregiver, the primary caregiver, or the maker of other caregivers? Are they the doer, or are they the developer of others?
So important.
And Carl, you jump in, please.
Well, there's a reality here about leadership that has to do with vision, of course, but there's also a passion part of that vision. And when I was studying the Korean churches, I was very impressed by one of the habits of the young Korean pastors. They would typically spend Saturday night in fasting and prayer at the church. They would get on their knees in their study, and they would plead with God for the next day. Well, I picked up a tip or two from that kind of passion and found myself kneeling at a chair and crying out to God, asking him for help and for clarity. And what I discovered was that if your pursuit of God is strong enough, there's an awful lot you can miss in terms of academic preparation to come up with what you need for the next morning. But there's a point in time where no matter how passionate your search for God is, and no matter how much effort you put into it, you find yourself spinning your wheels. And you begin to say, what's going on here? I'm giving this everything I've got. God knows I'm sincere. I'm running a short list of accounts with God. I've got everything unconfessed or confessed that I need and can imagine. And after I give it everything I've got, at the end of the day, I'm still not getting where I need to go. And that's where moving into the barrier discussion becomes really fruitful. Until a guy has hit that barrier a time or two and realizes, I'm slipping, I'm not going forward. Reminds me of these rock climber four-wheel drive vehicles I see. They advance up a bank to a certain point, and then they, just before they get over the top, they stall because they begin to slip backwards. And we've seen that over and over again in churches. And what the seminar series picked up on was the kinds of things you struggle with at 200 are not exactly the same things at 400 and 800. At 200, you're dealing with being willing to share the caring ministry with your team. It's the Jethro jump, and realizing you cannot be adequate to all people, enough to take you to the next level. Then you have to figure out what do I do if I call people alongside to help me on my staff, for example. How do I do that? There are problems there, and there are secrets there as well. And when you get up a little later, you're dealing with having to cope with your lay leaders who want to be a part of the action and want to dilute the vision and take it off point because they have agendas of their own as well. And so we and these barriers, we step people through. What are the leadership things that you need to learn how and master in order to get to that next level? Because you've got to, on the one point, lead, on the other point, collaborate. And it's a It's because you're always compromising. When you collaborate, you're always compromising, and the why gets lost. And so we have to go back and say, well, hold on, what is the core of this barrier, and to what extent am I creating the problem that I'm trying to solve?
And the book was written so that both the leader and the board and the key players, both lay and staff, can all read it together. In fact, I just recently had a church, the pastors, the board, they read it, they were stuck at a particular level, and I said, all right, let's use this book as a diagnostic. Where, from reading it, where do you see that you're stuck, and what do you need to do?
Yeah, I wonder if you could give us some examples there, Warren, of that. That seems to be a critical shift, this shift from kind of shepherd, primary caregiver to, developer, coach of caregivers. What are some of the things practically that pastors should do or maybe are doing to make that transition, which is a huge change for most leaders?
The simplest thing is the apprentice model. You could almost look at what Jesus did with the 12 as an apprenticeship program, and that Mark 3, which says that Jesus appointed 12 to be with him, and he gave them authority to do different things. Just that first step of, in everything I'm doing, do I have a shadow? Am I showing, do I ever do a hospital visit alone? If I do, foul. I should be training someone while I'm doing it. And then, not just now that I'm modeling it, but what about my key leaders, both paid and volunteered? Do they get the idea of apprenticing themselves? 2 Timothy 2:2, train others who train others who train others who train others.
Absolutely. Was there anything in the shift in this particular concept over, the decades between when these two editions of this book were written that shifted or changed? That, this idea of empowering others, obviously it's the idea of apprenticeship is as old as time. Was there anything around how that's working out in churches that looks a little different today?
Carl, why don't you tell about how apprenticeship through the bus ministries, which was in the first ministry, which that was a big deal at the time. It was very significant, but it was an apprenticeship model. Here's a manageable span of care, and today there are equivalents.
Yes, there are. The challenge with any discussion of apprenticeship is that we tend to want to go to a model where we label everything and tie it down and say, this is what an apprentice looks like, and we put a little formula together. What I discovered is that there's a pre-apprenticeship appreciation and awareness that's critical to moving into the apprenticeship model. And it has to do with recognizing what God is doing in the people around you. A woman comes to me from my church, and she says to me, I was down at the hospital, and I was talking to one of the patients, and she was so fearful. And I thought, I really should try to comfort her in some way. And she says, I thought about what I could do, and I opened the Bible, and I read the 23rd Psalm to her. And then she looked at me, and she said, did I do the right thing? And I said, absolutely, you did the right thing. And she came back to me on another occasion, and she'd done something very similar. She says, well, you said it was okay, but then I offered to pray for her. And was that okay? Absolutely, that's okay. And then I began to realize, wait a minute, a typical lay person not being ordained, not being recognized as a spiritual leader per se, not getting the apprentice model that would be a moniker or a title that would be helpful. They're out there kind of on their own wondering, is it okay? But what they're doing is under the impulse of the Holy Spirit, but they don't know that. But here are caregivers with a pastoral gift in your milieu coming to you for affirmation. And if you're not really careful, instead of giving them the affirmation, you'll say, oh my goodness, I need to go down to the hospital and do that prayer with that woman, or I need to go down to the hospital and read that psalm to that point. Instead, say, bless you, you are so on target. My goodness. And then I was in a mental health meeting, and I was watching a psychiatrist deal with a woman, and she was volunteering to help him in his practice. And I watched him carefully as he listened to her, and he said, so what's motivating you to do this is a desire for community service. He said this. And when he said that phrase, what's motivating you to do that, it was a discernment question for him. And I thought, wait a minute. I can use that. I need to start asking when people come to me, what's motivating you to do that? If they're if I'm insecure, I'll say, oh, they're trying to criticize my performance. But if I'm alert, I will look at them and say, there's something motivating this person to do this. There's a caring impulse in them that is the gift of the Holy Spirit. That's an evidence of a spiritual giftedness. My job is to give breath to that, to blow on that coal, to make it glow, and to say to them, yes, this is so right. Have you considered that your impulse to do that and your desire to do that could be a gift from God, and that makes you a gift to the church? Because once I started using that language, people started blossoming, and they were willing to accept. Young pastors come to me and say, oh, I can't get anybody to take a leadership position because they don't want the responsibilities of leadership. Whenever I hear that, what I know is I've got an immature leader on my hands. Because if the people in his church are not willing to take a leadership responsibility, that's not entirely cultural. Part of that is conditioned. He is not affirming those people when he sees micro evidence of gifts. He wants macro evidence of gifts. Well, if you don't fan the spark of the micro evidence, you're not going to see the macro come into play. And once people begin to get the idea, you mean God could be working through me? I could be helping? Oh, wow.
It's huge.
And then you brag on that in front of the rest of the congregation, and we have a section in the book on the casting of vision for this kind of thing. What you brag on, you see more of. What you applaud, you get more of. And people go, oh, well, if that's what maturity looks like, then I can step up for that too, because I have those impulses as well. So this whole idea of empowering the congregation is so essential to any kind of growth barriers, and that's a big section of the book, How to Break Growth Barriers.
This is the unSeminary podcast. Stuff you wish they taught in seminary.
The changes between the first edition of the book and the second include the recognition of the existence of the internet and the social media and the communication devices we now have available to us. Huge difference in the speed with which we can make connections and stay in touch with each other. And this call is an evidence of that.
Absolutely.
So this is part of it.
That church planner I was telling you about earlier, his Facebook strategy is core to how he's reaching his people. Like it's not like even for someone that comes from like a large, mega church or whatever in communications, I would say Facebook is more important to him than even that, that scenario. He's really using that, maximizing that to draw his community together, to reach people, to, which is a new dynamic for sure.
It is. And the second major difference between then and now is the degree to which most statements about how widespread any effect is are now quantified. You heard Warren say 87%. Back in the day, we would have said, something like over 80%. And we would have been thumbnailing it, or we'd been approximating it. And now we can actually quote Ed Stetzer or somebody and say, hey, we've surveyed 300 churches, and now we have to, in order to criticize a piece of data, we have to examine the group that was surveyed and the technique that was used. And in other words, we're using a lot more sophisticated tools. It doesn't mean we get better knowledge necessarily, because experienced people in the field pick up on where the trends and so forth are. But at least we have the ability to make statements that are defensible and can be revised by some methodology than opinion. And that's another huge difference in the two styles.
Very cool. Well, we're going to keep moving along. I thought before we move into the lightning round with Carl, Warren, I wonder if you can give us, people who listen into unSeminary, I literally could do every week someone selling a book. People all the time are like, hey, can you come on here? And I just don't do it a lot. Because I want to trust the authors. I want to have some sort of relationship with. And Warren, like I say, this book from the early 90s, I actually was trying to find my copy of it this morning. I think I've actually given it away to someone else. So I'm excited that you've updated it. Why don't you give us a thumbnail around why the re-up, and why people who have the checkmark version from 20 years ago, why they should pick up this copy, and then where they can get it.
We updated the illustrations of different churches, the heroes of the time, the Chuck Swindoll's and others. We replaced with more modern illustrations. We changed early edition. We had used the Jethro model to say, okay, you need to do more than be a a shepherd of your church. You need to be, and we use Lyle Shaller's term, of a rancher and people didn't like that. They said, I still want to be the shepherd. And they were right. So we changed that to kind of the player coach versus the pastor, in that you're still in the game, and yet you have a coaching role for others in the game. As Carl alluded to earlier, we dealt with social media. We dealt with multi-site being a much more of a viable factor. But the core issue of do you really believe that there are unchurched people who need Jesus around you that your church could reach without saying, yeah, but we need more money. Yeah, but we need more staff. Yeah, but, and you know what, by the way, if you don't change your model, you just get another staff and they become the hired hand who gets exhausted.
Right.
If they really aren't the maker of other ministers. So the book is fresh for today, the same core ideas, and just as workable for discussing as a leadership team or as a board to say, okay, how do we go to the next level as a church? And this will give it, I know that.
Very cool. Yeah, I know if people want to pick it up, you can get it at Amazon, or if there are still bookstores available somewhere, you can pick it up in those places. I'm not sure where those are, but you could get it on Amazon. We'll put a link in the show notes as well, so that you can find it. Listen, people, I really do think you should pick up a copy of this book. It's foundational reading, even if you read the checkmark version from years ago, or the, because there's like this. That's what I remember on the front. Maybe I guess it was a growth arrow going up. You really should pick that up. Well, we're going to jump into the lightning round, that part of the episode where we ask everybody who's on the show to answer questions. And Carl has graciously agreed to go along, which I got to be honest, I feel a little bit silly asking you these questions, sir, but I'm going to ask them to you anyway. So, Carl, what's an online resource that you're using these days that's helping you out in your ministry?
Google.
Yes. Oh, totally.
I'm there 10 times, 20 times a day. So it's a continual, no getting away from it. All of the electronic media, communications, messenger, email, all that stuff. I try to stay away from Facebook only because it's a sucking hole, and it's hard to limit it to 2 hours once you get going.
Nice.
But my latest ventures are in the area of blogging. I've started blogging, so that I will be able to carry some of the insights forward.
Great.
And that blog is at consultingforgrowth.org.
Consultingforgrowth.org. That's right.
Yeah, perfect. We'll put a link to that in the notes too, so people can pick up about that. Carl, what's a book you've read in the last 6 months or maybe to a year that's had an impact on your thinking or ministry?
Jim Hanley from Orange, California. Jim Hanley wrote a book called Healing the Shattered Soul. As I have worked with failed missions and with failing missions, I have begun to find soul wounds in people, in leaders. And people who supervise church planters see this frequently, but they don't know what to make of it. They think of it as fickleness, they think of it as failing to follow through, mercurial behaviors, etc. But what we're actually dealing with there is a wounded soul and the demonism that comes along with it, the attack of the evil that comes along with it. And Henley has put together the single best resource on that I've ever seen. And I'm heavily into that because my own background includes deliverance ministry. We used to call it exorcism, but it's deliverance ministry. But what we didn't find was why deliverance ministry is only partly effective. And the reason for that is because of the wounded soul in people. So that's sometime have me on and we'll talk about the wounded soul, but
sure,
because that's a very significant area for making progress and for finding spiritual strength and healing.
Very cool. What's another ministry that you're looking to inspire you?
Are you speaking of organizations?
Yeah, it could be organization, could be another church, could be anything.
Probably the most significant single person I've met in the last few months is Todd Wilson, who's the executive over at Exponential.
Yep.
Exponential church planting group people. That guy is unbelievable in terms of both dedication and ability,
right,
and has put together the finest program for encouraging church planters that I've ever seen. I've agreed to join with him for the East Exponential East in 2017 down in Orlando, where I'll spend 2 or 3 workshops down there for him, just because I want to bless him and be a part of what I think is a very significant and very good work.
Yeah, it's amazing. Exponential, if you haven't had a chance to be a part of it, is it's really, and it's an incredible movement, really, of multiplication, church multiplication, which is amazing.
Yes.
If you could get 50...
And the interesting thing about Exponential is that if they are successful, our book is even more important.
Right.
Because if you start a church and you start growing with it, all of a sudden you no longer have a church plant. Now you have a church that's maturing and scaling upward.
Absolutely. If you could get 15 minutes with any leader alive, who would you want to get that with and why?
Bono.
Oh, nice. From you too.
Yeah, Bono. I'm very impressed with him because he comes to it from an artistic point of view, but he hasn't lost his core faith, and he has a heart big enough to reach out toward people that are hurting.
Nice.
And I'm very impressed with that.
Cool. Well, what does Carl George do for fun when he just kicks back and he's not thinking about growth barriers and he's not thinking about, all this stuff? Where does he, just relax and have some fun? What do you do for fun, Carl?
Well, besides playing with my grandchildren, it's playing with my wife's Australian Labradoodles.
Oh, nice. That's
She's
cool.
She's a breeder of Australian Labradoodles, and
wow.
And I deal with those animals every single day. They're just absolutely delightful.
Nice. Well, guys, I really appreciate you being on the show today. Like I say, we'll put a link in the show notes. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that or learn more? We talked about, Carl, your blog. Is there any other way they should be in touch, or is that the best thing they could do?
That's for me. Consultingforgrowth.org is the best.
Perfect. And then Warren, with your work with Leadership Network, is that the best place for them to, if they want to follow you a little closer?
Right. I'm on Twitter at Warren Bird, just as it's spelled one word, and research at leadnet.org. And if you want to track with the weekly newsletter we put out, it's leadnet.org/update, and it's called Leadership Network Advance.
Nice. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate you being on the show today.
Rich, God bless you. You have an awesome podcast. I listen to it and recommend it all the time. Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Don't be shy. We'd love to connect. Check out unSeminary Inbox. You can sign up at unSeminary.com, and we'll send you helpful training resources every week. Plus, you'll gain immediate access to our exclusive members area with tons of resources you can use. Connect with Rich on Twitter at Rich Birch or through email, rich@unseminary.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode at unseminary.com. It includes links to what we talked about today and more. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Did you enjoy today's episode? Drop by iTunes and leave a review. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Join us next week when we'll learn more stuff we wish they taught in seminary.